Tons of fun for the entire family. Animals, antiques, art and crafts, displays. Raffle tickets are $10 and include entry. Travel from Grand Cayman is a breeze with extra same-day flights on Cayman Airways. Check them out on Facebook at BRAC Agriculture Show. Don't miss the 18th annual Cayman BRAC Agriculture Show, Saturday, March 23rd.
If you can't make the show, tune in to Radio Cayman for coverage throughout the day of the 18th annual Cayman BRAC Agriculture Show.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky. At the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, helping people plan for retirement is at the heart of what we do. To help improve our member experience, we would like to receive feedback from our members and employers. Send us your feedback on the overall experience and suggestions for improvements by email at pensions@chamberpension.ky or by calling 743-9125 or 745-9130. We are committed to improving member experience, which helps you make more informed decisions that lead to better pension saving outcomes. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We are here for you.
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome to Money Sense. I'm Simon Caudery and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. James Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher, you have an extremely intriguing career. You were once upon a time a politician, a minister indeed in the government of St. Lucia, and now you run your own consulting company and are a passionate advocate for climate action. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning to you and thank you for having me, and good morning to all of your listeners.
I'd like to start, if I may, with a couple of challenges. There are deniers in today's world about climate change. Are there any data points that they use when these deniers say it's not real? Are there any data points that we or you as a promoter of the understanding of climate change and the catastrophic impacts it has, are there any data points they're using that the other side is doing a very bad job of refuting?
Well, I'm hoping that there are no deniers of climate change who reside in the Caribbean or in any other small island developing state, because it would be difficult to reconcile their denial of climate change with what is happening around us. I think you do not need empirical evidence, you do not need data points, you do not need peer-reviewed journals, you do not need the latest assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change if you live in the Caribbean or some other small island developing state to see that the climate is changing, that the long-term weather patterns that, very often people confuse weather with climate, and weather is what is happening now. Climate is a long-term observation of weather patterns, long-term observation of temperature, of precipitation, of all of these things. I think it is very clear to anyone living in the Caribbean that our climate has changed and it's continuing to change. When you look at what has happened to water variability, to water, to precipitation, how our precipitation levels have changed, how before we used to experience droughts in some of our countries once every 15, every 20 years. Now some of our countries in the Caribbean are in a perpetual state of drought. Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis are in a perpetual state of drought. If you live in the Caribbean and you spend any time near the coast, I think it would be difficult to refute climate change when you see how much sea level rise has taken place, how much of your coastline has disappeared in the last 15, 20 years, in the last 5 years because of rising sea levels. I think it would be difficult to deny that our hurricanes have gotten stronger. When you see the impacts of a Hurricane Dorian, for example, on the Bahamas, and not just the intensity of that hurricane, but how long it lingered in the Bahamas. Or if you read the news and you see what happened with Tropical Storm Otis, which when it was approaching Acapulco, approached as a tropical storm, and in the space of 12 hours, it developed to a Category 5 hurricane. So these are all observations. These aren't even the empirical data points that are necessary. But then when you look at the empirical data points and you realize that the last 9 years have been the hottest 9 years in the history of our planet since we started recording temperatures. So every one of the last 9 years has not, if it hasn't set a record, it certainly has been a hot year. And 2023 was the hottest year by far, breaking the record that was set in 2016. June 2023 was the hottest June ever. July 2023 was the hottest month ever, not just hottest July, but the hottest month ever. August 23 was the hottest August. September was the hottest September. October was the hottest October. I'm sure you see where I'm going with this. We've started off in January by January being the hottest January. That's January 2024. And February being the hottest February ever. We've seen temperatures of over 50 degrees Celsius in Morocco. We've seen temperatures in the North Pole and the Arctic. That temperature increase is outpacing the global temperature increase by 4 times. In the Antarctic, in Antarctica, we're seeing a 3 times increase over what is being seen everywhere else. We're seeing ice melting in Greenland that is exceeding what climate scientists had thought would be our worst case scenario by the year 2070. So we're 50 years ahead of what scientists thought would be our worst case scenario. And then to link that to greenhouse gases, we are seeing a continuing increase in our emissions of greenhouse gases to the point where 2023 was when we had the biggest emissions of greenhouse gases ever. So not only are we seeing empirical evidence of climate change with sea level rise, with stronger hurricanes, with longer droughts, with more intense flooding, but we're also seeing the correlation with greenhouse gases, specifically methane and carbon dioxide, and how that is correlating almost exactly with the temperature increases and the other increases that we see.
There was a documentary done by a former vice president in the US, Al Gore, his documentary on climate change. And a lot of the data points that you have mentioned, he also used some of those data points. So there's a lot, the science has evolved and it's improved and all the rest of it. But you must, when you go traveling around the world, you must have met people who say, so what? I don't believe you. Or not so what, but I just don't believe you, or your data is wrong. How do you, the data has been there for 30 years, 40 years, perhaps longer. And yet people are still, there are many people who are still just don't either want to get it. Is it they don't want to get it, they don't get it, or is there something else that's going on?
Well, I can tell you that most of the people who tell me I don't believe you have not looked at the data. So they are approaching this from an emotional point of view. They believe that we have no control over the planet. Some people believe that it is very haughty and arrogant of man to believe that he can control the planet. I know that that is an argument that has been used by some U.S. congressmen. James Inhofe, for example, a senator in the U.S., is very famous for saying that it's very arrogant of man to believe that he can do anything about the climate, that this is something that God controls. So very often the people who dispute climate change are not disputing it on the basis of science, because there are very few things. I'm a scientist by training, and I can tell you that there are very few things that you could get unanimity among scientists on. Climate change happens to be one of those things, that over 99% of scientists tell you that there is irrefutable evidence that there is that the climate is changing, that global warming is taking place, that it is as a result of man-made changes, that it is anthropogenic, as we put it. So it's not natural variability. It's not something that we've seen from the time of the dinosaurs, and that's why the dinosaurs went extinct. No, this is man-made. This is something that is caused by our incessant need for fossil fuels to fuel, literally and figuratively, that this need we have for more and bigger and better. So yes, there are climate deniers. There will always be climate deniers, but the island on which they're standing is getting smaller and smaller. And I think their voices are getting a little less vigorous. And what they're probably saying now is, okay, there is climate change, but it's not going to be as bad as you're making it out. And you guys are doom and gloom scientists, and you're making this thing out to be much worse than it really is. And this thing will come back to normal at some point. And again, the science is not saying that. So the people who refute climate change do it on an emotional level, on an anecdotal level, but certainly not on an empirical level, because I haven't seen anyone present me with evidence, irrefutable scientific evidence that says that the climate is not changing and that there isn't global warming taking place, and it is not being caused by man-made, by actions that we are responsible for.
You made an interesting point. You said that not only people aren't doing it on empirical evidence, or they're saying, but there's always a but to it. And one of the buts I've heard people say is, well, but you're asking me to give up so much in order to solve this problem. You're asking me to give up buying a new car. You're asking me to give up my future prosperity, because I'm running a country in Africa, or I'm running a country in South America, or I'm operating in that country. And you're saying, well, I must give up the future prosperity of the people in that country because I have to give up the ability to produce electricity, to burn the Amazon in order to power the country. That has some validity, in the sense that we've all come from a country, from the countries in the West have burned through their resources to get to the wealth level they are. And now you're saying to the poorer parts of the world, you can't get to our level of standard of living.
Well, actually, no, I'm not saying that. And
not you, but that's
no,
the
no,
argument
but that's not the climate argument. The argument of those people who are calling for action on climate change is not that there should not be development, and it's not that we should sacrifice our pace of development and we should not proceed at the same pace that the industrialized nations did. It's just that we should do it differently. And we're also saying to the developed countries that you need to do it differently, and that there are new spheres of economic opportunity that will open up, and new employment opportunities that will open up by shifting to a more circular economy. There's a concept called Earth Overshoot Day. And it's interesting that what we've had over the last 3 days in both the Bahamas and Cayman is the economic outlook put on by RF Bank and Trust. So we're dealing with finance people. And if there's one thing finance people understand, it's using resources and running short of resources. So Earth Overshoot Day actually calculates when we would have used up all of the resources that the planet can regenerate within a year. So it's like you have a budget. You have a family and you have a budget. You've set yourself a budget, an annual budget of $50,000 to run your expenses for yourself, your wife, and your 2 kids. And at what point of the year do you use up all of that money? You hope that when you set that budget on the 1st of January, that you use up that budget on the 31st of December. You would hope that you don't use it up before that, because if you've used up that budget before that, then it means you have to borrow money, or you have to find some other way to raise that money. Earth Overshoot Day last year was on the 2nd of August. So it meant that on the 2nd of August 2023, we used up all of the resources that this planet can regenerate within a year. This year, Earth Overshoot Day is on the 25th of July. So it means that we will be using up by the 25th of July all of the resources that this planet can regenerate during a year. So if the planet were you, what you'd have to do is go and borrow money or borrow resources to tide you through for the rest of the year. The planet can't borrow resources. So what we're doing really is putting our planet deeper and deeper into resource debt, because we are developing at an unsustainable pace. Our industries are too extractive, and that is what is fueling a lot of what we're seeing right now. So what we're saying is, let's move to a circular economy. Let's move to how we can reuse, and let's now, instead of burning fossil fuels, let's generate, first of all, let's work on the technology to bring the price of solar and wind down, to bring the prices of batteries down, to develop ocean thermal energy conversion technology that will be useful for small island developing states like ours, so that we can produce energy year-round from the temperature gradient in our ocean. Let's look at improving the efficiency of offshore wind, so that we can now move away entirely from fossil fuels to renewable energy and have the same pace of development that we had before.
Let me pose this though. When somebody from the US or somebody from the UK or France or Germany starts saying to an emerging country, yeah, just wait for these new technologies, let's wait until wind power can do this. But so give up on the fossil fuels, because if we don't all give up on fossil fuels today, we're never going to reach the targets we need to, and we're all going to be underwater. But the developing country will say, I don't care about your ESG rules written by these people who've already burnt all these resources. I care about making my people in my country sufficiently wealthy that they can afford to buy bread in the shops. So the idea that one must wait and delay the ability to improve on standard of living, great sometimes with people in emerging countries, and coming from the wealthy, doesn't it?
Except when you look at what the impact of not doing that would be. So if you're a country like the Cayman Islands, for example, and you are doing reasonably well because they're financial services, and you see that we're heading right now, if nothing changes, if we continue to adopt a business as usual scenario, we're probably heading to a planet that is warmer by 3 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. Then you will look at what that will do to Grand Cayman, to Cayman Brac and Little Cayman, and you will see that many of the places that you have very high priced real estate on, many of the places where you have hotels on, many of the places where you have your electricity power plants and your hospitals and your schools will be underwater.
Unfortunately, psychology tells us that humans are very poor about projecting into the future and understanding those concepts.
Well, not really. I don't think so. I think because you're seeing it already. This wave motion that you had in February, you're seeing freak events that are becoming less and less freak and more commonplace. And that is and the climate change that is impacting is not just impacting small island developing states anymore. Greece had its longest and most intense heat wave last year. Phoenix, Arizona had a heat wave that lasted over a month. You've seen the wildfires in Canada and what those wildfires in Canada did to the quality of life on the eastern seaboard of the United States. People in New York could not go out, could not breathe because of those wildfires in Canada. You've seen wildfires in South America, wildfires in Australia, wildfires in Africa. You are seeing a planet that has reached its tipping point or is reaching its tipping point. And if that is not enough to compel people to take action, to understand that, look, we're not saying immediately stop the use of all fossil fuels. We are saying let's work towards the phasing out of fossil fuels so that we can get to net zero by a particular point in time, which will still make it possible for us to contain this increase in temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. If that does not stir the same people who are already experiencing climate impacts, not as much as we are in the Caribbean, but they are experiencing it, climate change might be an existential threat for us, but it is still a threat for every single country on this planet. So if they don't understand that this is a threat, not just to small island developing states and these, little countries that, okay, if they disappear, what's the big deal? It's much more important for us to keep our economies afloat. They may keep their economies afloat, but they may not keep some of their coastlines afloat.
We're going to take a brief break. Please do stay with us and join us in 60 seconds as we continue our conversation on climate change with Dr. James Fletcher.
At the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, helping people plan for retirement is at the heart of what we do. To help improve our member experience, we would like to receive feedback from our members and employers. Send us your feedback on the overall experience and suggestions for improvements by email at pensions@chamberpension.ky or by calling 743-9125 or 745-9130. We are committed to improving member experience, which helps you make more informed decisions that lead to better pension saving outcomes. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We are here for you.
This is Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back to Money Sense, where I'm joined today by Dr. James Fletcher, and we're discussing climate change and the impact it has and why we should all be concerned about it. Dr. Fletcher, before the break, we're talking about climate change, obviously, and we're talking about some of the impacts and some of the threats and some of the concerns. You mentioned in a presentation I saw, you mentioned that the Paris deal on climate change was almost scuppered by a US requirement that the word shall must be changed to the word should for legal reasons. I understand lawyers will be listening to this and go, oh, absolutely, shall means something very different to should. Because otherwise they wouldn't pass any new, otherwise they in the US would have to pass a new law in Congress. Doesn't that itself point to the problem that we face, whereby the US isn't willing to take the chance of, or isn't able to pass a law to say that climate change is a problem? It says, we're only going to do that, we're only going to try to do this. We're not actually going to pass any laws. How's action ever going to happen anyway?
Well, I think if you look at the law that President Biden passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, that is a very, very climate change. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's an act that really is focused on taking action against climate change. So I think
it doesn't stop any fossil fuel burning.
It doesn't, and it's something
that's a vote winner. You can't do things against vote winning.
Yeah, but then when you look at what's happening individually by some of the states, they are definitely doing some of that transition, particularly more progressive states like California. Mm-hmm. So the United States is a peculiar character because you have some very strong, intense lobbies. You have the fossil fuel industry is a very strong one in the United States. So you will always have those difficulties, always have those fights in there, particularly when these fights coalesce along partisan lines. But we've seen, certainly under President Biden, a much more concerted and a much more sincere effort to address climate change than we saw under President Trump. So that is a step in the right direction. It's certainly the United States is not 1.5 degree compliant yet. The United States has not taken the steps that would bring its emission reduction down to the level that we need for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there's a lot more that needs to happen in the United States. There's a lot more that needs to happen in the United Kingdom. And in many European countries, that is absolutely for certain. And that is why right now we're heading more towards 3 degrees Celsius than we're heading towards 1.5.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Paris Accord was very much, we must stick to 1.5. We mustn't go beyond that because the impacts will be catastrophic.
No, the Paris Agreement was that we should strive to get to 1.5, that 2 degrees Celsius. Before we got to Paris, the world had agreed on 2 degrees Celsius as a long-term temperature goal. Small island developing states in particular and other climate vulnerable countries said that 2 degrees Celsius was too high, that 1.5 degrees Celsius, from the scientific evidence that we had in front of us, quite abundant scientific evidence, that pointed very clearly to 1.5 degrees Celsius being the threshold. So the wording of the Paris Agreement is that it's 2 degrees Celsius, striving to bring it down to 1.5.
But aren't both of those unrealistic?
No, they're not. They're not
So
unrealistic.
we're going to go way beyond that.
Well, we are initially because of El Nino and because we haven't done what we have
Then won't
to
it be
do.
too late? Those things
No,
that
it won't
will
be.
melt,
It
will
won't be.
melt.
No, it won't be. It won't be. The intention is that we get to 1.5 by the end of the century. When we negotiated Paris, it was always with the understanding that there would be overshoot of 1.5 at some point. What the target is that by the that's why it's called a long-term temperature goal as opposed to the immediate temperature goal. The intention is that we get back down to 1.5 before the end of the century. Now, that does not mean that if we keep it to 1.5, we're safe. We're not safe. We've seen at 1.2, 1.3, 1.5, 1.4, we are already experiencing some of the catastrophic impacts of climate change. So we're already behind the 8 ball as small island developing states. But what we have to do is ensure that we can get those mitigation reduction levels down to the point where we can keep that temperature graph to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius.
For my own education, more than anything else, perhaps, we are on a path between now and the end of this century where we will go way beyond 1.5 or way beyond 2 in terms of temperature growth.
If we keep a business as usual
Yes,
scenario.
exactly.
Yes.
So I don't know whether it's 3.5, whatever the number is. So there is a curve where we will grow above 3% perhaps, and then go down in an ideal world to 1.5.
No, I don't think if we get to 3 degrees Celsius that we'll ever get back down to 1.5. So the 1.5 scenario does not have us going to 3 degrees Celsius. What we have right now are different scenarios. There's a scenario, a business as usual scenario that will get us to 3 degrees Celsius. If we stick on that path, we will never be able to get us back to 1.5. However, even the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario still understands and still appreciates the fact that there will be overshoot. There will be temporary overshoot of 1.5, but with the possibility of getting us back down to 1.5.
Is there a point where your optimism fades?
There is, because once you've used up, it's a mathematical equation. There's a certain amount of carbon dioxide. Once it's in the atmosphere, it will lock in 1.5. And it will make anything and then it starts locking in different temperature scenarios. So once you've used up that carbon budget, for example, then you are locked into a temperature increase of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. The reason they call greenhouse gases is because when you emit carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, they rise and they form this film around the planet, and that film works like the covering of a greenhouse. It traps the heat. So the more of that carbon dioxide that's emitted, then the more heat that's being trapped. So once you've exceeded that carbon dioxide budget, then you will lock in 1.5 as your long-term temperature, and then you start locking in higher temperatures.
But one criticism that's leveled is that you spend an awful lot of time advocating to not raise the temperature, advocating to keep...
No. We spend a lot of time advocating for a change in our development model. So we spend a lot of time saying that we cannot continue on the development model that we are on right now.
Agreed, sorry.
Because it is extractive, it is not sustainable, and eventually, it's not just climate change is not the only crisis this planet is facing. It's facing a pollution crisis when you look at the amount of plastics that's out there. It's facing a biodiversity crisis with the amount of extinction that's taking place. It's facing a crisis of too much nitrogen and phosphorus being put out into the atmosphere. It's facing a crisis of water. There's a change in the amount of clean water that's available. So out of the 9 planetary boundaries that have been established, we have breached 6 of them. So climate change is not the only crisis. Climate change is the most obvious one. But what we keep advocating for is to move away from this extractive model that really is depleting the resources of this planet at a rate much faster than our ability to regenerate. And that's what sustainable development is about. It's about ensuring that we embark on development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's what we advocate for, not just a taming of the temperature.
Sorry, understood. And I phrased my question inelegantly. So if I may, the criticism, though, is that the focus is on changing the behavior as opposed to dealing with the inevitable. So let me explain what I mean by that. So I have a conversation with a good friend of mine who is a staunch advocate of the environment, and I play devil's advocate with him in the same way I suppose I'm doing with you. And I say, why aren't you trying to argue much more strongly in favour, and I pose the same to you, of extracting carbon dioxide? Accept that it's going to happen, because the tragedy of the commons simply says people don't care about it.
Extracting it how?
I don't know, because...
Well, that's it. You don't know. So that's like saying to me...
But equally, we know that people aren't going to do this.
No, but we do know how to transition away from fossil fuels.
People aren't doing it.
Yeah, but don't tell me why aren't we focusing on a technology that doesn't exist? Because you're saying to me, why don't we focus on extracting carbon dioxide? Why aren't we focusing on teleporting to another planet? Because if we can teleport to another planet, then we deal with the problem that we have here on this planet. We don't have the technology to teleport to another planet, the same way we do not have the technology right now to extract carbon dioxide and store it in a manner that is safe and will not make it available again. So we have to deal with the technologies that we have available to us, and the technology is to move away from fossil fuels and to use renewable sources and to stop extracting from our planet resources that we cannot regenerate.
But you would like us to invest capital on making ever more efficient fuel cells, ever more efficient solar cells, wind power. You'd like that investment to be made, I presume.
I'd like that investment to be made. I'd like there to be investment in ocean thermal energy conversion and in offshore wind and in geothermal and in hydropower, in all of the renewable sources.
But as a insurance policy, in the same way that we all buy an insurance policy on our car hoping we're never in an accident, would a not an insurance policy also say, let's make some investment in technologies that aren't fully understood yet, in order that if we don't get this right, if we actually fail in this mission, we've got a potential insurance policy?
No, I'd say that would be very, very risky, very, very foolish thinking, because you're saying to me that I should now invest in something that does not exist instead of investing in something that does exist and I know works. Why should I do that? Why should I deviate from something that is in front of me, that works, that is proven, the science shows that it works, and if we can just get people to do it, how can the mitigation of that be investing in something that we don't know about? That doesn't make sense. I can't see any insurance company that would say to you, let's invest in a car that doesn't exist rather than improving the car that we do have.
The response perhaps to that comes right back to Cayman. People in Cayman are asked to say, reduce your carbon footprint. Let's behave as more sustainable citizens. Quite reasonable request. Let's not throw away things. Let's try and recycle. Then someone says to me, but are the billion people in China doing that?
But that's not being asked of people in Cayman. Caribbean as a whole contributes 0.2% of the global inventory of greenhouse gases. So if the entire Caribbean were to transition away from fossil fuels to renewable sources, it would not make a dent in that temperature curve.
So why bother?
Why bother? Because you are paying 40 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity because you're importing fossil fuels. You're not Trinidad and Tobago. You don't have oil and gas that would allow you to generate your own electricity from fossil fuels. So you're paying 40 cents per kilowatt hour. So it means that your hotel sector and every single sector that requires energy as an input is not as competitive as it should be. So why you should bother is that by moving to renewable sources, you could bring the price of electricity down. You could remove your exposure to the volatility on the world oil market. So anytime there's a Russia-Ukraine crisis or crisis in the Middle East, as we have now with Israel and the Palestinians, that has an inflationary impact on oil prices, you suffer. Every time there is a somebody sneezes in the oil sector, you get that cold. So that's why you should bother, because it makes economic sense for the Cayman Islands to move away from the use of fossil fuels to using renewable, because you can now say to this hotel, to this manufacturer, to whatever, that for the rest of the life of your business, that you would pay no more than 15 US cents per kilowatt hour of electricity, because the price of the sun doesn't go up and the price of using solar doesn't go up. In fact, what will go down, it'll go down because these fuel cells will become more efficient, those solar panels will become more efficient, those wind turbines will cost less to build. So we will actually guarantee you that over the life cycle of your project, the price of electricity will go down. I dare you to say that to any company right now, depending on fossil fuels. That's why you should do it. And also, because it now gives you the moral authority to say to the developed countries, I am a contributor of 0.002% of global greenhouse gases. Yet, I understand the role that I must play in this global commons. I understand that I have a responsibility, even if, as the UNFCCC says and the Paris Agreement says, it is a common but differentiated responsibility. So I don't have the same responsibility that India and China has, but I still have a responsibility because I live on this planet. So I am taking the steps to reduce my emissions of greenhouse gases. Why can't you, India, and you, China, do it? Because when you do it, everybody else benefits. When I do it, it's just I'm doing it because I have a moral responsibility to do it.
And my last question is about exactly that, the moral responsibility. You move in circles I don't move in. You speak to ministers, you speak to people who are decision makers in these areas. Do you think the argument of moral persuasion, moral authority. I've done the right thing, shouldn't you? Do you think that matters to them?
No, and I think what we need to do, which is what I said in my presentation yesterday, is that we have to look at litigation. The tobacco industry never, and it's the same thing in the oil and gas sector. The tobacco industry never admitted, despite the volumes of scientific evidence of people keeling over with lung cancer and all sorts of respiratory cancers caused by nicotine, caused by tobacco smoking, refused to admit. In fact, they had lobbyists to counter this argument. They only admitted when we started litigating and when they had to start paying through their pockets. We have to do the same thing with the oil and gas sector. We have to now start looking at litigation. And there's a very interesting test case in front of the International Court of Justice right now that seeks to establish whether countries have a legal responsibility to take action to prevent this imperiling of lives and livelihoods in small island developing states. In 2022, in July 2022, United Nations General Assembly established that every citizen on this planet has a legal right, a human right to a healthy environment. So if you have a right, if the right to a healthy environment is a human right, and there is a country or there's a company that is imperiling that right, then should there not be some liability that attaches to that company? And should they not be made to compensate or to take some action to stop what they're doing if it is imperiling your life and putting your livelihood at risk?
How do you think that argument would go in the US legal system?
Well, let's see how it goes at the ICJ. If you're looking at a US system that wants to protect vested interests, then I don't know how it'll go. But let's look at an independent arbiter and let's see how it plays out. And I think that's what's important for us to look at.
It's been a fascinating conversation. We've gone around a whole host of topics, and I really appreciate both your passion and your obvious research into this industry. It's the education that you've been able to bring to the show has been wonderful. So thank you very much for joining.
My pleasure.
And thank you to all listeners for tuning into Money Sense on Radio Cayman. Please do tune in again in 2 weeks' time, and thank you once again for joining us this morning.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky. At the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, helping people plan for retirement is at the heart of what we do. To help improve our member experience, we would like to receive feedback from our members and employers. Send us your feedback on the overall experience and suggestions for improvements by email at pensions@chamberpension.ky or by calling 743-9125 or 745-9130. We are committed to improving member experience, which helps you make more informed decisions that lead to better pension saving outcomes. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We are here for you.
That was a pre-recorded Money Sense. Radio Cayman time check now 8:09.
Feast without the fuss.
This Easter, make Foster's